My name is Claire Whitfield, and I am 36 years old, and for exactly 4 years, I have been the most important employee at my husband's company that nobody, including the company itself, has ever put on payroll. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense once you understand the precise, specific nature of that invisibility. I am a forensic CPA. I spent 6 years at a regional accounting firm tearing apart fraudulent ledgers for a living before I left to do exactly the same work, unpaid, in the dark, for a company that had my last name nowhere on its letterhead. The company is called Whitfield Premier Construction. My husband Marcus owns 60% of it. His mother Eleanor owns the rest. I own 0% of it on paper. I want to be precise about that number because precision is the entire architecture of what I'm about to tell you. And precision is also, as it turns out, the thing my mother-in-law has never once respected in her life. The night this story really starts was a Saturday in October in the backyard of Eleanor's house. A wide stone patio strung with the kind of warm white lights that say money quietly instead of loudly. 31 guests in good clothes, a 4-tier cake with the company logo piped onto the top in blue icing, because this wasn't just a birthday. It was the 10th anniversary of Whitfield Premier Construction, and Eleanor had spent 6 weeks planning a party that was, in every meaningful way, a celebration of herself. I had spent 4 years keeping that company's lights on. I had spent that particular Saturday afternoon reconciling 3 vendor accounts that were 45 days past due, on my own laptop, at my own kitchen table, because if I didn't, the framing crew on the Belmont Street project wasn't getting paid by Monday. I showered. I put on the green dress Marcus likes. I drove to my mother-in-law's house and smiled at 31 people while carrying, in the back of my mind, the exact dollar figure of how close we'd come that week to missing payroll entirely. Eleanor stood up around 8:30 with a glass of champagne, the way she does, commanding a room the way certain women learn to do by the time they're 40 and never unlearn. She thanked the contractors. She thanked the architects. She thanked by name 4 people who work in the front office and have never once seen the actual bank statements. And then she looked across the patio at me, directly at me, in front of everyone, with the specific bright smile she uses when she's about to say something cruel and call it honesty. And she said the sentence I have now heard in my head roughly 400 times since. And of course, we have to thank Claire for marrying into all this so beautifully. Some women marry for love, some marry for money. I've always said Claire is smart enough to have done both. The patio laughed. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. 31 people, most of whom I have known for years, most of whom have eaten dinner at my table, laughed. Not cruelly, not even maliciously, in the easy, reflexive way people laugh at anything delivered with enough confidence and enough champagne. Marcus laughed too, half a beat behind everyone else, the way you laugh when you're not entirely sure if something was a joke or a warning shot, but you've decided it's safer to assume joke. I did not laugh. I sat very still in my folding chair with my champagne untouched in my hand, and I felt something settle into place inside me that I can only describe months later with the benefit of everything that happened next, as clarity rather than anger. Anger would have made me stand up. Anger would have made me say something I'd have to apologize for later. What I felt instead was the specific, cold, professional stillness I feel when I'm 3 pages into a ledger and I've just found the first number that doesn't reconcile. The moment before you know exactly what you're looking at, but you already know with total certainty that you're looking at something. I reached into my purse. Marcus glanced at me, and I watched him do the calculation men do when they sense weather changing in a room and aren't sure yet whether to brace for it. I gave him nothing. I pulled out my phone, and I want to tell you exactly what I did next, because I've thought about this moment more than almost any other moment of my adult life, and I think the precision of it is the only thing that makes the rest of this story make sense. I did not open a text message to my sister. I did not open social media to perform some small, satisfying act of public distance from the party I was sitting in. I opened the QuickBooks Online app, the one I had installed on my own personal phone 2 years earlier, under my own login, with admin level access that nobody at that table except Marcus knew I still had, because I had been the one who'd insisted, 4 years ago, in the worst week of our marriage, that someone outside Eleanor's direct control needed eyes on every dollar that moved through that company. I opened the app. I navigated, with the calm, practiced fingers of a woman who has done this exact sequence of taps 1,000 times, to the company's accounts receivable aging report, the document that shows, in cold, unforgiving columns, exactly which clients owe exactly how much money and for exactly how long they've owed it. And I sat there in the warm white party lights, in my green dress, with my mother-in-law's laughter still hanging in the air around me, looking at a number that none of the 31 people on that patio knew existed. It was a number large enough that if I closed that app right now and walked away from this marriage and this company forever, Whitfield Premier Construction would not survive the quarter. And it was a number that existed entirely because of decisions I had made, quietly, carefully, without credit for 4 years, to keep it from being twice as large. I looked up from the screen, and across the patio, Eleanor was already mid-sentence into her next toast, already moving on to thank the caterer, having no idea that the woman she just publicly called a gold digger was sitting 11 feet away from her, looking directly at the one document in the entire world that proved, with total mathematical certainty, exactly the opposite of everything she'd just said. I didn't say anything that night. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the dramatic version, where the wronged woman stands up immediately with the receipts in hand and the room goes silent. That isn't how I work, and it isn't, as it turns out, how the most effective kind of reckoning ever works. I have built an entire career on the principle that the person who speaks first in a room full of assumptions is rarely the person who wins. The person who wins is the person holding the actual numbers when everyone else finally stops talking. I closed the app. I put my phone back in my purse. I smiled at the table, the specific smile I have practiced my whole professional life, the one that gives nothing away, and I let the party continue around me exactly as if nothing in that backyard had just changed. But something had changed. Because for 4 years, I had been doing the quiet, invisible, uncredited work of holding my husband's family business together out of love and out of partnership, and frankly, out of habit. And I had never once stopped to ask myself what would happen if that family ever decided my work and my money and my silence weren't worth thanking out loud. Eleanor had just answered that question for me, in front of 31 witnesses, with a champagne glass in her hand and a joke on her lips. And 3 weeks later, I would find out exactly how far she and my husband were already planning to take it. To understand why I was sitting on that patio in October, with admin access to a company that doesn't pay me, you have to go back 4 years, to a Tuesday night in March, when my phone rang at 11:40, and I knew, before I even looked at the screen, that it was Marcus, and that it was bad. I want to describe the sound of his voice in that call, because I have never heard it again since, in 4 years, not once. And I think the fact that I never heard it again is itself part of this story. Claire. Just that. My name. Flat. With no breath behind it. Claire, I think we're done. I think the company's done. I sat up in bed. He was at the office, alone, at almost midnight, and I could hear, underneath his voice, the specific silence of an empty building, that particular quality of quiet that exists only in commercial spaces after hours, no hum of other people's conversations, just the hard echo of a man's own voice in a room built for 40 people who'd all gone home. I drove there in my pajamas. I want you to understand what kind of man Marcus is, because it matters for what comes later. He is genuinely good at building things. He can read blueprints the way I read balance sheets, instinctively, the way some people have an ear for music. What he has never been good at, not once in the 11 years I've known him, is the financial side of running the thing he builds. That gap, between what he could construct and what he could account for, is, I would learn over the following 6 hours, exactly the gap his mother had spent 2 years quietly exploiting. I found him at his desk with 3 years of bank statements spread out in front of him like a crime scene he didn't have the training to read. And because I do have that training, it took me less than 90 minutes to understand what he hadn't been able to see in 2 years of living inside it. Whitfield Premier Construction was 4 months behind on payments to two major subcontractors. There was a balloon payment due on an equipment loan in 11 days that the company did not have the cash to cover. And underneath all of it, in a pattern I recognize the way you recognize a signature you forged 100 times in your own head from studying it, Eleanor had been pulling distributions from the company's account for 2 years, calling them owner draws, at a rate that had nothing to do with what the business could actually sustain, while telling Marcus repeatedly that the slow months were just how construction works, sweetheart, it always comes back. Dr. Shirley Glass, the psychologist who spent decades researching family financial dynamics, describes a specific pattern she calls comfortable blindness, the way people allow themselves not to look closely at numbers when looking closely would force them to confront someone they love. Marcus hadn't been stupid, he'd been comfortable. And comfortable, in a small construction company with thin margins, was exactly the kind of luxury that runs out of road fast. The bank was set to call the equipment loan in 11 days. If that happened, the bank could seize the trucks and the framing equipment, which meant no active job sites, which meant no incoming revenue, which meant the whole structure would come down in a sequence I could already see laid out in my head like a flowchart of dominoes, each one perfectly explainable on its own and completely lethal in combination. I had $28,000 in a personal savings account. It was money I'd been building, slowly, methodically, for almost 6 years. Half a down payment on the house I actually wanted us to buy someday. The kind of money you don't talk about at parties because talking about it makes it smaller somehow. I sat at that desk at 2 in the morning, looking at my husband's face, and I made a decision that I have never regretted and have also never, until that October backyard, fully explained to anyone. I was not going to hand my husband $28,000 as a gift. I want to be very clear about why, because I think it's the single most important decision in this entire story. A gift disappears the moment it's given. It has no weight, no shape, no name on a piece of paper anywhere. I had spent 6 years of my professional life watching families destroy each other over exactly this kind of informal generosity. Money that moved with love and vanished with memory, until two people were standing in a lawyer's office 5 years later, each one swearing under oath to a completely different version of what had actually happened. So at 2:15 in the morning, sitting in my husband's office with his head in his hands, I told him I would cover the loan payment. And I told him it would not be a gift. It would be a loan, from me, to the company, secured against the company's equipment and accounts receivable. The exact same collateral structure a bank would use, because I had spent 6 years learning exactly how banks protect themselves, and I saw no reason I deserved less protection than a stranger in a suit. Marcus didn't argue. I think in that exact moment, at 2 in the morning, with the building seized in 11 days, he would have agreed to almost anything that made the immediate problem go away. He signed where I told him to sign. I drafted the note myself that week. Every clause, every term, language I'd written 100 times for other people's deals and was now, for the first time, writing for my own life. I had it notarized at a shipping store on a Saturday morning, the same kind of forgettable strip mall errand you'd run to mail a package. I asked my own sister Renee to come along and sign as a witness, because a note with a witness's signature is a note that's much harder to later claim never happened, the way everyone remembers it happening. And then, on the following Monday, on my lunch break, I drove to the county recorder's office and filed it. The same public record system a bank uses when it puts a lien against a piece of property. The system that exists specifically so that whoever has a real, secured financial interest in something shows up the moment anyone goes looking. I never told Eleanor any of this. Marcus, to his credit, didn't either. Not because we were hiding something shameful, but because the company survived. The immediate crisis passed, and like most families in the aftermath of a near disaster, everyone simply preferred to talk about anything else. I want to tell you what I felt driving home from that recorder's office on a Monday afternoon with a stamped, filed copy of a document that quietly, legally, made me a secured creditor of my own husband's family business. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel powerful. I felt, more than anything, like a woman putting on a seatbelt before a drive she sincerely hoped would be uneventful. A small, boring, responsible act that you do precisely because you hope you'll never need it. I filed that document away in a safe deposit box at my bank, along with the original promissory note, and I went back to my life. I kept covering vendor payments when the cash flow ran thin. I kept reconciling accounts on my own kitchen table late at night after Marcus had gone to bed, because somebody needed to know, in real numbers, exactly how close the company was running to the edge at any given moment, and I had long since stopped trusting that somebody would be Eleanor. For 4 years, that recorded document sat quietly in a county database that almost nobody ever has a reason to search, until the exact moment somebody does. And on a Saturday morning in early November, 3 weeks after that backyard party, I would learn that Eleanor and Marcus had already started making plans that depended entirely on nobody ever searching it at all. I found out about the buyout plan the way I find out about most things that matter in my life. Not because anyone told me, but because a number didn't add up. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November, 3 weeks after the anniversary party, and I was sitting at the kitchen table doing the thing I do every other Tuesday, which is reconciling the company's accounts against the bank feed before the bookkeeper, a sweet, overworked woman named Patty, who works 15 hours a week and has no idea how much weight actually rests on her part-time shoulders, runs her monthly close. I'd done this so many times it had become almost meditative, a kind of quiet I looked forward to, oddly, the one part of my week that felt entirely mine. What I found instead was a wire transfer of $4,000, dated 2 weeks earlier, paid to an entity called Ashworth Strategic Advisory, with a memo line that said simply, Consulting, Ownership Transition. I want to explain why those 3 words made my stomach drop in a way that no amount of professional training fully prepares you for. I am a forensic accountant. I have spent my entire career reading memo lines for exactly this kind of buried signal, the small, boring phrase that someone typed quickly, not expecting anyone to ever look closely, that turns out to be the one piece of language that tells you everything. Ownership transition is not a phrase a company uses when nothing is changing. It's a phrase that exists, specifically, to describe the legal and financial process of moving who owns something from one person to another. Nobody had told me anything was transitioning. I sat with that wire transfer open on my laptop for almost 20 minutes before I did anything, because the forensic accountant in me has learned, over 6 years of professional practice, never to act on the first thing you find. The first thing you find is rarely the whole picture. It's a thread, and you don't pull a thread until you understand where it's attached. So I did what I do for a living. I started pulling threads quietly, methodically, the way you'd want someone pulling them if you ever hired a forensic accountant to find out where your own money had gone. I searched the company's vendor file and found 3 prior payments to the same entity, Ashworth Strategic Advisory, going back 5 months, each one small enough on its own to pass through Patty's monthly reconciliation without raising a flag, because Patty, bless her, was never trained to ask why a construction company was paying a strategic consulting firm with no obvious connection to permits, materials, or labor. Together, the 4 payments totaled $11,000. $11,000, paid quietly over 5 months, to a firm whose name I did not recognize, for work nobody had mentioned to me. The woman who, on paper, owned none of this company, and who had also been the only person keeping its books honest for 4 straight years. I did the thing I always do when a number doesn't reconcile. I went looking for the human story behind it, because numbers never lie, but they also never explain themselves. I found Ashworth Strategic Advisory's website that same evening, after Marcus had gone to bed early claiming a headache. A small, professional-looking site with exactly 1 photo of exactly 1 man, a consultant named Gregory Ashworth, whose stated specialty, printed right there on the homepage in calm corporate language, was facilitating ownership transitions in closely held family businesses. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 that night, with that website open on one screen and the company's bank records open on the other, and I felt the same cold, professional stillness I'd felt on that patio in October, the recognition of a pattern fully formed, even before I had every piece of it in hand. Eleanor was not simply unhappy with how I'd been described, or who got credit at parties. Eleanor was actively paying someone, quietly, for 5 months, to help restructure who actually owned Whitfield Premier Construction. I want to tell you what happened the next morning, because it's the detail that turned a worrying hunch into something I could no longer pretend not to see. Marcus left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, an ordinary, unremarkable thing, the kind of small carelessness that happens in every marriage, every single day, meaning absolutely nothing most of the time. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that, the way I've tried to be honest about every other choice I made in this story. I walked past that counter to get my coffee, the same as I do every morning, and a single sheet of paper sitting beside the laptop, half covered by a folder, caught my eye only because it had my own name typed at the top of it. Claire Whitfield, equity position, none. Below that, in a column I recognized instantly as the structure of a corporate buyout document, the kind I have drafted, reviewed, and torn apart professionally more times than I could count, was a single handwritten word in the margin, in Eleanor's distinctive looping cursive, the same handwriting that signs Christmas cards and grocery lists and, apparently, notes to herself about restructuring her own son's marriage out of his company's future. The word was buyout. I stood at that counter for exactly as long as it took the shower upstairs to keep running, holding a coffee mug I'd forgotten I was holding, looking at my own name on a document that had clearly been drafted to formally, legally, permanently establish, in writing, with a consultant's professional letterhead behind it, that I had no equity, no ownership, and therefore, presumably, no standing to object to whatever came next. I put the paper back exactly where it had been, half under the folder, at precisely the angle I'd found it. I picked my coffee up off the counter, and I walked back to the kitchen table, where my own laptop sat open to a county recorder's database I had not needed to access in 4 years. I typed in the property address of Whitfield Premier Construction's equipment yard, the same address that had been listed as collateral on a promissory note I'd had notarized at a shipping store on a Saturday morning, 4 years and a lifetime ago. The record came up exactly the way I'd filed it, still there, still active, still, as far as the public record of the state was concerned, completely unknown to the woman currently paying a consultant $11,000 to plan a future that assumed I had no claim on anything at all. I closed the laptop. Upstairs, the shower shut off, and I heard Marcus start moving around the bedroom, getting ready for a day that, as far as he knew, was entirely ordinary. I had 4 years of invisible work behind me, a filed legal document neither of them remembered existed, and a buyout plan with my name on it that assumed, with total confidence, that the woman who'd been quietly holding this company together had nothing, absolutely nothing, to hold back with. I smiled at Marcus when he came downstairs. I poured him coffee. I asked about his day exactly the way I always do. And underneath that ordinary Tuesday morning kitchen conversation, I had already started building, in the part of my mind that never fully turns off, the file that was going to make sure every single person in that family understood, eventually, on a day and in a manner I would choose myself, exactly what they had actually been standing on this entire time. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles over a house when one person knows something the other person doesn't, and I lived inside that quiet for the better part of 3 weeks, moving through ordinary days with my husband, dinner, laundry, a Sunday afternoon spent painting the hallway a color we'd been arguing about for months, while building, in parallel, a file that would eventually contain everything either of us would need to understand exactly what had been happening underneath our marriage. I want to explain what I mean by building a file, because I think people imagine forensic accounting as something dramatic, and the truth is almost the opposite. It is slow. It is administrative. It is profoundly, deliberately boring, because boring is what survives a courtroom and a family argument equally well. The version of me that gathers evidence does not feel rage while she's doing it. She feels the specific, narrow focus of someone double-checking a number before she lets herself believe it. So that's what I did. Every Tuesday, when I sat down to reconcile the books the way I had for 4 years, I started keeping a second, private copy of every document, not to hide anything from the company's actual records, but because I had learned, professionally, that the only thing more dangerous than no documentation is documentation that exists in only one place, controlled by only one person, who happens not to be you. I pulled 4 years of accounts payable history and built a single spreadsheet that did something nobody in that family had ever done. It laid out, month by month, exactly how much cash I had personally contributed or covered, against exactly how much Eleanor had personally withdrawn. I want to give you the shape of that number, because I think it matters more than any single anecdote I could tell you. Over 4 years, I had quietly covered or directly loaned the company just under $61,000 across 11 separate near crises. Vendor payments, a missed insurance premium, 2 payroll gaps, the original equipment loan rescue that started all of it. Over the same 4 years, Eleanor had withdrawn, in owner draws she was technically entitled to take as a partial owner, just over $218,000, at a rate the company's own cash flow could not sustain, which is precisely why I kept having to step in behind her. I did not build that spreadsheet to humiliate her. I built it because somewhere in my training, in 6 years of watching families lie to themselves about money, I had learned an unglamorous but absolute truth. The person who tells the most convincing story always loses to the person who has the most boring, complete, dated record. Stories can be denied. Spreadsheets, when they're built correctly, simply sit there and wait to be believed. The harder discovery came 2.5 weeks in, on a Thursday evening when Marcus mentioned, almost casually over dinner, that his younger brother Tyler was thinking about getting more involved in the business. Tyler is 29. Tyler has worked across his adult life at a brewery, a car dealership, and most recently, briefly, a gym, and has never, as far as I am aware, read a balance sheet in his life. Tyler getting more involved in the business was not, on its own, an alarming sentence. People say things like that at family dinners constantly, and nothing comes of it. What alarmed me was the way Marcus said it, not as an idea floated, but as a fact already partially arranged, the specific flatness of a man repeating something he'd been told rather than something he'd thought through himself. I asked lightly, the way you ask something you've already decided is important. Involved how? Marcus shrugged in the particular way he shrugs when he doesn't fully understand something and has decided not to think too hard about it. Mom thinks he should take over some of the ownership side eventually. Succession planning, she calls it. Says it's smart to start thinking about it now. Succession planning. Another phrase, like ownership transition, that sounds entirely reasonable in isolation and entirely different once you've already found a buyout document with your own name marked None sitting on a kitchen counter. I went back to my laptop that night after Marcus had gone to bed, and this time I searched the county recorder's database for something other than my own filed lien. I searched Whitfield Premier Construction directly. Every document attached to the business's name across the past 6 months, the same way I would search any company I was professionally investigating. What I found was a draft operating agreement amendment, filed not as a final recorded document, but as a preliminary registration, the kind of paperwork law firms file to reserve a process before the real transaction happens. It proposed restructuring company ownership from the current 60-40 split between Marcus and Eleanor into a new 3-way structure: 40% Marcus, 30% Eleanor, 30% Tyler. There was no line for me anywhere in that document. There had never been a line for me anywhere in any document, which had never bothered me before, because for 4 years I had genuinely believed that my contribution lived in the relationship, in the trust, in the unspoken understanding between a husband and wife that what one person builds quietly for the other person's family is still, somehow, theirs together. What I understood now, reading a draft amendment that planned to hand my husband's younger brother 30% ownership of a company I had personally kept solvent 11 separate times, was that this family had never actually believed that. They had believed something much simpler and much older, that what a wife contributes, however essential, however load-bearing, belongs to the family she married into only for as long as that family finds it convenient to say so. I sat with the amendment open on my screen for a long time that night, and I want to describe exactly what I felt, because I think it's the part of this story people understand least. I did not feel betrayed exactly. Betrayal implies a promise was broken. Nobody had ever promised me equity. What I felt instead was the specific, clean recognition of being correctly informed, finally, about the actual terms of a deal I had been operating under for 4 years without ever having seen them written down. I closed the laptop. I went upstairs. I lay down next to my sleeping husband in the dark, and I made a decision that, looking back, was the actual turning point of this entire story. Not the patio in October, not the wire transfer, not even the draft amendment itself, but this quiet moment, lying awake at 1 in the morning, deciding precisely how I was going to use the 4-year-old document sitting in a safe deposit box across town. I was not going to confront Marcus with anger. I was not going to call Eleanor and demand an explanation over the phone, where she could control the room the way she controls every room she's ever stood in. I was going to wait for them to bring it to me, because they would, eventually, since a 30% restructuring requires every existing owner's signature, and I held, whether either of them currently remembered it or not, a recorded financial interest that made my signature matter more than they understood. I fell asleep around 2, and I woke up the next morning to a text from Marcus that confirmed, with almost comic precision, that the wait was about to be much shorter than I'd planned for. Mom's coming by Sunday. Wants to walk through some paperwork with us. Should be quick, just a formality. A formality. I read that word 3 times over my coffee, the same way I'd read consulting, ownership transition, 3 weeks earlier, and I understood with total certainty that Sunday was going to be the day they finally handed me the pen. Sunday arrived the way I had spent 4 days carefully preparing for it to arrive. Ordinary on the surface, with a roast in the oven and the good placemats out, because I had decided, somewhere around Thursday night, that whatever else happened in that kitchen, it was not going to look like a woman who'd seen this coming. Eleanor arrived at 4, exactly on time, the way she always does, carrying a leather folder under one arm and a bottle of wine in the other hand, the specific combination of a woman arriving for a pleasant family visit and a woman arriving to close a deal. She kissed my cheek at the door. She told me the roast smelled wonderful. She asked about my sister's new apartment with what felt like genuine interest, and I answered her with what felt, I'm fairly certain, like genuine warmth, because 4 years of forensic work teaches you something most people never have to learn. You can be completely sincere in a room and still be the only person in it who understands what's actually happening. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where, 4 years earlier, Marcus had signed a promissory note at 2 in the morning while the rest of the world slept, and Eleanor set the leather folder down in front of her with the unhurried confidence of a woman who has never once in her life expected to be told no. I want to talk to you both about something important, she said, opening the folder. And I want to say up front, Claire, that none of this is about you not being valued. You've been wonderful for this family. This is just about being smart, long-term, the way Ray always wanted it run. I want to pause on that sentence because I think it's the exact moment I understood how this entire afternoon had been rehearsed. Ray was Eleanor's late husband, Marcus's father, a man who had built the original framing business 30 years ago and died 9 years before I ever met any of them. Eleanor had never once, in 4 years of family dinners, invoked Ray's name to settle an argument. She invoked it now because she needed an authority in the room that neither Marcus nor I could push back against, and a dead man's wishes are the single most unanswerable authority available to anyone. She slid a document across the table. Not the draft amendment I'd already found, but a clean, finalized version, printed on heavier paper, with signature lines at the bottom and Gregory Ashworth's firm name in small type along the footer. 40% Marcus, 30% Eleanor, 30% Tyler. A line at the bottom requiring the signature of all current equity holders and any party with a recorded financial interest in company assets, which I noted silently was language Ashworth had clearly included precisely because somewhere in his due diligence he had found my lien and hadn't yet told Eleanor what it meant. "It's mostly a formality at this point," Eleanor said, echoing the exact word Marcus had used in his text 4 days earlier, which told me everything about where that word had originally come from. "Tyler's ready to step up. It'll be good for him. Good for the company, too, having more family hands on deck." Marcus, beside me, was nodding along in the specific way he nods when he has decided in advance that agreeing is easier than understanding. I looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way you look at someone you've shared a bed with for 6 years, trying to find the version of him that had called me at midnight 4 years ago, terrified, asking for help he didn't know how to ask for any other way. He didn't look back at me. He was looking at his mother, the way he has looked at his mother his entire life, waiting to be told the room was safe. I picked up the document. I read it slowly, the way my father, not Marcus's father, mine, a man who spent 30 years as a union electrician and never signed a single contract without reading every line out loud first, a habit I inherited, the same way some people inherit eye color, taught me to read absolutely everything that asks for my signature. I got to the third page, to a clause buried in dense paragraph form between two sections that looked, deliberately I now believe, more important. It stated that upon execution of the new ownership structure, all prior informal financial arrangements between any equity holder and the company would be considered settled and released, and that no party would retain any further claim against company assets outside the terms explicitly stated in the new agreement. I set the document down flat on the table, smoothed it once with my palm, the way I do when I want a moment to think before I speak, and I said, evenly, in the same voice I use when I ask a client's bookkeeper a question I already know the answer to, "Eleanor, can you read this paragraph out loud? Just this one, the part about prior informal financial arrangements." She glanced down at it, and I watched something flicker behind her eyes. Not recognition exactly, more like the specific irritation of being asked to slow down when you'd planned for the room to move quickly. "It's just boilerplate, Claire, standard language. Gregory includes it in everything." "I'd still like to hear you read it," I said, out loud. "I think Marcus should hear it too." She read it. Her voice didn't shake. Eleanor's voice has never once shaken in front of me. But she read it faster than she'd read anything else on that page, the way you read something you'd rather move past than dwell on. When she finished, I let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "What prior informal financial arrangements," I asked, "are you referring to specifically?" "There aren't any that I'm aware of," Eleanor said. "It's standard release language. Every buyout agreement has it." "There's one I'm aware of," I said. I want to describe the next 4 seconds carefully, because I have replayed them more times than almost any other moment in this entire story. Marcus turned to look at me, genuinely confused, a man who had simply never been told the specific details of a Tuesday night 4 years ago, because by the time he woke up the next morning, the crisis had already quietly resolved itself, and he had, like most people in moments of relief, never asked exactly how. "What are you talking about?" he said, not unkindly, just lost. I reached into my bag, the same bag I'd carried to the patio in October, the same bag that had held a phone open to an aging report 11 feet from his mother's laughter, and I took out a single folded sheet of paper, soft at the creases from having been refolded and unfolded several times that week, as I'd decided exactly when this moment would happen. I set it on the table between the three of us, on top of Eleanor's leather folder, on top of Gregory Ashworth's careful release language. 4 years ago, I said, I loaned this company $28,000 to cover an equipment loan default. It's documented as a secured note against company equipment and receivables. It's notarized, it's witnessed, and it's recorded with the county, which means it's already public record, which means whoever you hired to write this agreement either knows about it and didn't tell you, or doesn't know about it yet and is about to. Eleanor's hand, I noticed, had gone very still on top of the folder. "That's not possible," she said. I would know about something like that. You would, I said, if anyone had told you. Nobody told you because nobody needed to, until today, when you brought me a document asking me to release a claim you didn't know existed. Marcus picked up the paper. I watched him read it. Really read it, his lips moving slightly the way they do when he's concentrating on something he doesn't fully understand. And I watched the exact moment he reached the bottom, where his own signature sat next to mine, dated 4 years ago, witnessed by my sister, notarized at a shipping store on a Saturday morning he had apparently never once thought about since. I signed this, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. You signed this, I confirmed. At 2 in the morning, the night the bank was going to call your equipment loan. You don't remember the details because you were exhausted and scared, and I told you it would be okay. And it was okay, because I made sure it was okay. That's what this is. That's what it's been for 4 years. Eleanor reached for the paper. Marcus, without quite seeming to decide to, pulled it slightly back, out of her reach. Just an inch, just enough that I noticed it. And I think he noticed himself noticing it. This needs to be reviewed, Eleanor said, and for the first time since she'd walked through my front door at exactly 4 o'clock, her voice had lost its unhurried confidence. Before anyone signs anything, Gregory needs to see this. Gregory, I said, is going to find it whether you show it to him or not. It's recorded. That's the entire point of recording something. I picked the document back up off the table, refolded it along its same soft creases, and put it back in my bag. Nobody asked me not to. I'm not signing the release, I said, and I'm not signing the new agreement until I understand exactly what settled and released was supposed to mean for a $61,000 history neither of you apparently knew you needed to settle. Eleanor closed the leather folder slowly, the unhurried confidence trying, visibly, to reassemble itself. We'll revisit this, she said, once tempers have cooled. My temper, I said, standing to check on the roast, which had exactly 4 minutes left, has been completely calm this entire conversation. I'd ask you to notice that, actually. It might tell you something about how long I've known this was coming. Eleanor left that night without finishing her wine, which I noticed because Eleanor never leaves a glass unfinished. And Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour after she'd gone, the roast cooling between us, neither of us touching it. I want to describe what that conversation was actually like, because I think people expect the version where the husband immediately sides with his wife, apologizes for everything, and the two of them face the mother-in-law together as a united front by morning. That isn't what happened, and I think the honesty of what actually happened matters more than the satisfying version would. Marcus was quiet for a long time, turning his water glass slowly on the table, and when he finally spoke, what came out of him wasn't anger at his mother. It was something closer to grief, the specific grief of a man realizing all at once that he had spent 4 years not asking a question whose answer had been sitting in a safe deposit box the entire time. Why didn't you ever tell me you recorded it? He asked. Like, officially, with the county. Because I didn't want it to feel like a threat, I said. It wasn't supposed to be a threat. It was supposed to be insurance. The kind you hope you never have to use. And now you're using it. I'm not using it to hurt anyone, I said. I'm using it because your mother brought a document into this house, asking me to sign away a financial interest she didn't know I had, and I'm not going to sign away something I don't fully understand just because everyone at the table wants the conversation to be quick. He didn't argue with that. I think, more than anything, what kept Marcus quiet that night was the particular shame of realizing how completely he had let his mother run the financial architecture of his own marriage, without ever once asking the woman he actually lived with what she thought the architecture should be. I didn't push him toward an apology. I've learned, across 6 years of watching families fall apart over money, that the apology that matters is never the one you extract in the heat of the discovery. It's the one that survives a week of quiet afterward, once the adrenaline is gone, and the person has had time to decide, on their own, what they actually believe. What Marcus did instead, 2 days later, was ask me a question I hadn't expected. What do you actually want? he said, out of all this. Not what you're entitled to, what you want. I had thought about this more than he could possibly know, lying awake at 1 in the morning weeks earlier, and I told him the truth, which was simpler than either of us expected. I didn't want to own 30% of his mother's company out of spite. I didn't want a public reckoning that humiliated her in front of family and clients, however badly her toast in October had stung. What I wanted was for the 4 years of invisible work I had done to be made visible, on paper, permanently, in a way that couldn't be quietly erased by a clause buried on page 3 of someone else's careful document. So on Monday morning, I called Daniel Pruitt, a business attorney I'd worked alongside on 2 prior fraud cases years before I'd ever met Marcus, a man whose entire professional reputation rests on being almost aggressively unimpressed by leather folders and confident voices. I told him everything. The original note, the lien, the buyout draft, the release clause, $11,000 paid to a consultant for an ownership transition I'd never been told about. Daniel listened the way good attorneys listen, without interrupting, taking sparse notes, and when I finished, he said the thing that mattered most. The lien is good, he said. It's properly executed, properly witnessed, properly recorded. That's not in question. What is in question is what you actually want to do with it, because there's a difference between holding leverage and detonating it, and you only get to choose one of those once you've made the call. We spent 2 hours that afternoon mapping out exactly what holding leverage, rather than detonating it, would actually look like in practice. Daniel drafted a formal demand letter, calm, precise, entirely free of emotion, the kind of document that simply states facts and consequences in plain declarative sentences, addressed to Whitfield Premier Construction's registered agent, which happened to be Eleanor, formally calling the full balance due on the secured note unless the company's existing ownership restructuring excluded any reference to releasing my recorded interest. We did not send it to humiliate anyone. We sent it because a recorded lien against company assets is the kind of detail that surfaces, with total certainty, the moment any bank, title company, or potential buyer runs a basic search against the business, which meant Tyler's 30%, Eleanor's careful restructuring, and any future refinancing the company might ever attempt were all, as of that letter landing on Eleanor's desk, frozen in place until the question of my interest was resolved. I learned what happened next, not from Eleanor, and not even from Marcus at first, but from a phone call Marcus received 4 days later, sitting beside me on our couch on a Thursday evening, from the loan officer at the company's bank, a man named Robert Cassidy, whom I'd never met, but would come to be quietly, professionally grateful to. I could only hear Marcus's side of the call, but I watched his face change in real time, the specific, slow drain of color that happens when someone explains a problem to you that you didn't know you had. He thanked Robert. He hung up. He sat very still for a moment, and then he turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not even surprise exactly, something closer to a kind of dawning, exhausted respect. The bank flagged the refinancing, he said. Mom went in last week to restructure the equipment loan, try to free up some cash for the Belmont project. Robert said the title search came back with an unresolved third-party financial interest. He said they can't move forward with anything, refinancing, new credit lines, none of it, until that's cleared. What did he say the interest was? I asked, already knowing. He said it's a recorded note, from 4 years ago, in your name. I didn't say anything immediately. I let Marcus sit with that sentence the way I had sat with it myself for weeks, the way you let any true thing settle before you decide what to do with the space it takes up. Mom's furious, he said. She thinks you did this on purpose, to embarrass her at the bank. I didn't do anything, I said. I recorded a legitimate financial interest 4 years ago, the same way any bank would, and I declined to release it without understanding what I was releasing. Your mother's the one who decided to walk into a bank without checking first whether anyone else had a recorded claim on the assets she was trying to refinance. That's not sabotage, Marcus. That's just what happens when you don't read the whole file before you act. He didn't argue with that either. I think by that point, 4 days after a roast went cold on our kitchen table, Marcus had finally arrived somewhere I'd been standing for almost a month. The specific, clean understanding that his mother had spent 2 years building a plan on the assumption that nobody outside her control had ever bothered to protect themselves, and that the one person who had, quietly, 4 years earlier, without telling anyone, was about to make that assumption considerably more expensive than she'd ever imagined. I want to tell you what I felt that Thursday evening, watching my husband absorb the news that his mother's bank had just frozen her own company's finances because of a document she didn't know existed. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly, though I understand why people might expect that. What I felt was the same cold, professional stillness I'd felt on the patio in October. The recognition that a number had finally, fully reconciled, after years of quietly not adding up. And underneath that stillness, something else. Something I hadn't expected to feel at all. I felt ready. Because 3 weeks later, Eleanor was hosting Whitfield Premier Construction's 10th year industry gala. 40 guests this time, not 31, including 2 reporters from the regional business journal who'd been promised an exclusive feature on 10 years of family-built success. And I had just received a call from Daniel Pruitt informing me that the formal notice he'd filed on my behalf, the one finalizing exactly how and when my recorded interest would be resolved, was scheduled to be served that same week. Eleanor had picked the date for her gala months in advance. Daniel had picked the date for service based entirely on court availability and certified mail timelines. Neither of them had any idea the 2 dates were about to land in exactly the same room. The gala was held in the banquet room of a restored downtown warehouse Eleanor had rented for the occasion, the kind of space with exposed brick and Edison bulbs strung overhead that photographs beautifully for a regional business journal, and by 7 o'clock that Friday evening it was full. 40 guests, a string trio in the corner, a step-and-repeat banner with the company logo for photos, and Eleanor moving through the room in a navy dress, glass of champagne in hand, doing the thing she has always done better than almost anyone I've ever met, making a room believe, completely, that everything in it was exactly as it appeared. I want to be honest about a decision I made that week, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened after. I did not go to that gala planning to create a scene. I went because Marcus asked me to come, because not coming would have raised more questions than coming would, and because, frankly, I had spent 4 years quietly holding this company together, and I was not going to spend its 10th anniversary hiding at home like a woman with something to be ashamed of. I wore the green dress, the same one from October. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because I chose it deliberately, not for sentiment, but because I have learned, across 6 years of professional practice, that consistency unsettles people who are expecting you to have changed. Eleanor saw me across the room in that same green dress, and I watched something flicker behind her eyes, the specific recognition of a woman noticing that nothing about my posture, my smile, or my presence suggested I had spent the last 3 weeks the way she clearly hoped I had: anxious, defensive, diminished. The 2 reporters from the regional business journal arrived around 7:30, a young man with a notepad and an older woman with a recorder clipped to her blazer, and Eleanor greeted them with the specific warmth she reserves for anyone capable of telling her story to people she'll never meet. She walked them through the room, introducing Marcus as the visionary who's carried his father's legacy forward, introducing Tyler, freshly inserted into the company's org chart, as the next generation learning the ropes, and introducing me, when she got to me, simply as Marcus's wife, Claire, with a small, practiced smile that gave the reporters nothing to write down. I shook their hands. I smiled. I said something pleasant about the renovated space. I want to be clear that I felt no urge in that moment to correct the record in front of strangers with a recorder. That was never the plan, and it was never going to be the plan, because I had learned, across this entire ordeal, that the version of justice that actually holds up is never the one performed loudly in a room full of people who don't yet have the context to understand it. It's the one delivered through the proper channel, at the proper time, to the proper person, in writing. Eleanor gave her toast around 8:15, standing near the step and repeat banner with the reporters angled to catch it. A glass of champagne raised the same way it had been raised in October, and I watched her deliver, almost word for word, the speech I had heard a version of a dozen times before. 10 years, family legacy, Ray's vision carried forward, the next generation stepping up to make sure this business outlives all of us. She didn't mention me this time. I noticed that. After October, she'd apparently decided silence was safer than another joke that might not land the same way twice. The room applauded, the string trio resumed, and at exactly 8:40, while a server moved through the crowd with a tray of small desserts, and the older reporter was asking Tyler a question about the future of the company, a man in a plain gray jacket walked through the warehouse's front entrance, carrying a slim leather portfolio, the specific, unhurried walk of someone who has done this exact job many times before and feels no particular urgency about a room full of people in cocktail attire. I knew who he was before he said a word because Daniel Pruitt had told me, 3 days earlier, exactly when the certified process server would be completing service, and I had told him, when he asked whether I wanted it delivered to the house instead, that no, the gala was fine. The gala was, in fact, perfect, because the demand letter and accompanying notice were a matter of public record the moment they were filed, regardless of where they were physically handed over. And if Eleanor was going to spend 3 weeks pretending nothing in her company's finances required urgent attention, while reporters documented 10 years of family-built success, then she could receive the actual paperwork in the same room where she'd built that story. I want to be precise about something because I think it matters morally as much as it matters legally. I did not arrange for him to arrive at that specific moment to humiliate her in front of the press. Process servers don't take instructions about cocktail hour optics. They show up when they show up, based on their own schedule and the address they were given. I had simply declined to ask Daniel to delay it, the way Eleanor herself had once declined to check whether anyone held a recorded interest in the company before scheduling a bank meeting. We had both, in our own ways, simply let our own timelines proceed without rearranging them around the other person's convenience. The man in the gray jacket asked a passing server something quietly, was pointed toward Eleanor, and crossed the room directly to her, the conversation around them thinning out the way conversation always does when something unscripted enters a room full of people primed to notice. "Eleanor Whitfield?" he said, just loud enough to be heard by the half-dozen people standing nearest her, which included both reporters. Eleanor turned, champagne glass still in hand, the hostess' smile already arranging itself on her face for whatever this interruption turned out to be. "Yes? I have some documents for you," he said, and held out the slim leather portfolio. "You'll need to sign here confirming receipt." I watched her face from across the room, close enough to see clearly, far enough to not be standing directly in the moment myself. I watched the exact second the hostess' smile faltered. Not collapsed. Eleanor doesn't collapse easily, but faltered, the specific flicker of a woman recalculating, in real time, what kind of evening this had just become, in front of exactly the 2 people in the building whose entire job was to notice things like this. She signed. Of course she signed. You don't get to decline a process server any more than you get to decline a tax audit. She took the portfolio and I watched her glance down at it, and I watched her register the formal letterhead of Daniel's firm, and I watched the older reporter, the one with the recorder clipped to her blazer, lean very slightly toward the younger one and murmur something I couldn't hear but didn't need to. "Everything all right, Mrs. Whitfield?" the younger reporter asked, pen already moving, the specific reflexive question of someone whose entire profession trains them to ask exactly that the instant something unscripted happens in front of them. "Everything's fine," Eleanor said, and her voice, for the first time all evening, had lost the smooth, unhurried confidence she'd carried through every sentence since 7 o'clock. "Just some routine business paperwork." I want to tell you that I felt vindicated in that moment, watching the woman who had called me a gold digger in front of 31 witnesses, now standing in front of 40 more, holding a portfolio whose contents she hadn't even read yet, already lying to a reporter about what it was before she'd had time to find out herself. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt, more than anything, the specific quiet stillness of watching a number finally, fully reconcile after years of refusing to add up. Not satisfaction exactly, but something closer to the relief of a problem you've been carrying alone, finally becoming visible to the people who'd insisted, for years, that no problem existed at all. Marcus found me near the bar a few minutes later, his face carrying an expression I'd come to recognize over the past month. Not quite alarm, something more like a man watching a structure he'd lived inside his whole life reveal, finally, exactly how it had actually been built. "That was the lien thing," he said quietly, "wasn't it? The formal notice." "It was," I said, "tonight, in front of the reporters." "I didn't choose tonight, Marcus," I said, and I want you to know I said it gently, because by that point in the evening, I had no interest in being cruel to him. My entire argument from the beginning had never been with my husband. Daniel filed when the court calendar allowed him to file. Process servers deliver on their own schedule. Your mother chose to schedule a press event during a month when she knew, or should have known, that a formal financial dispute with her own daughter-in-law was still unresolved. That's not a coincidence I engineered. That's just what happens when two separate timelines, run by two separate people who each stop checking with the other, finally land in the same room. He looked across the warehouse at his mother, still holding the portfolio, still attempting, with visibly diminishing success, to maintain the evening's careful narrative in front of two reporters who now clearly smelled a much better story than the one they'd arrived to write. "What's in it?" he asked. "The notice. What does it actually say?" "It says," I told him, "that I'm formally calling the note. Full balance, plus 4 years of accrued interest at the rate we originally agreed to. And it says that until it's resolved, nobody, not your mother, not Tyler, not anyone, finalizes any restructuring of this company's ownership." Across the room, Eleanor had finally opened the portfolio, reading it standing up, champagne glass abandoned somewhere on a passing tray, the warm Edison bulb light catching the exact moment her expression changed from composed irritation into something with considerably less composure in it at all. I want to tell you what actually happened in the weeks after that gala, because the version that would be easiest to tell you, the triumphant one, where the villain is publicly humiliated and the wronged woman walks away holding all the power forever, isn't entirely true, and I think the truth matters more than the satisfaction. Eleanor did not collapse into apology. I want to be honest about that immediately, because I think people watching a story like this expect a clean confession, and Eleanor, in the 4 years I've known her and in every year since, has never once been a woman who confesses cleanly to anything. What she did instead, 2 days after the gala, was call Daniel Pruitt's office directly, ask to meet, and arrive at his conference room with an attorney of her own, a calm, unhurried man named Walter Bryce, who specialized, it turned out, in exactly the kind of family business disputes that families like ours apparently generate with predictable regularity. The negotiation took 6 weeks. I'm not going to pretend it was simple, or that I felt nothing but cold professional satisfaction the entire time, because that wouldn't be true either. There were nights I cried in my car in the parking lot of Daniel's office building before I could make myself drive home. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because divorcing a financial entanglement from a family you still technically belong to is its own particular kind of grief, even when you're right, even when the numbers are entirely on your side. What we landed on in the end was this. I did not become a 30% owner of Whitfield Premier Construction, and I want to be clear that I never actually wanted that, not really. Owning a piece of a company my mother-in-law would continue to run felt, even at the height of everything, like trading one invisible labor arrangement for a slightly more visible one. What I wanted, and what I got, was the full repayment of my original loan plus 4 years of accrued interest, paid out over 18 months, secured by the same lien I'd already held, now formally restructured into an enforceable payment schedule that Daniel built with the same precision I'd once used to build a spreadsheet at my own kitchen table. Tyler's 30% went forward, eventually, but diluted, 20% instead of 30, with the difference absorbed by Eleanor's own share rather than mine, because once the company's true financial history was finally laid out in full, in writing, in front of Walter Bryce and Daniel Pruitt both, it became very difficult for anyone in that room to keep insisting that the person who'd kept the lights on for 4 years deserved 0% of anything. The thing I actually wanted, more than money, was something that came out of the negotiation almost as an afterthought. A clause, buried in the new operating agreement exactly where the old release language used to live, formally documenting, for the company's own permanent record, every instance across the past 4 years where I had personally covered a cash shortfall, with dates, with amounts, with my name attached to each one. I didn't need that clause to enforce anything. I needed it to exist. I needed there to be, finally, one official document somewhere that simply told the truth about what I had actually done, instead of the truth living only in my memory and a single folded paper in a safe deposit box. Eleanor and I have not had an easy relationship since. I want to be honest about that too. We are polite at family dinners. She has never apologized for the toast in October, and I have stopped expecting that she will, because I've learned something over the past several months that I think matters more than any apology could. Some people are not capable of admitting they were wrong about you, but they are entirely capable of behaving differently going forward once the cost of the old behavior has become expensive enough to notice. Eleanor has not made another joke about why I married her son. She has, on 3 separate occasions since the gala, asked my opinion on a vendor contract before signing it. I don't know if that's growth or simply caution. I've decided, for my own peace, that it doesn't matter which. Marcus and I are, I think, better than we were before any of this started, though I want to be careful about saying that too cleanly, because better came at the cost of him learning something genuinely painful about how much he had let his own comfort cost the people who loved him. We see a counselor every other week now, not because our marriage was in crisis, but because I had spent 4 years building a private architecture of financial protection that my own husband knew almost nothing about. And a marriage with that kind of asymmetry in it, I've come to understand, was never as solid as it felt from the inside. Dr. John Gottman's research on marital trust describes what he calls the bid for connection, the small, ordinary moments where one partner reaches toward the other for attention or support, and the relationship's health depends almost entirely on whether those bids get noticed or missed. I had been making bids for 4 years, quietly, through spreadsheets and shipping store notarizations and late nights at the kitchen table, and Marcus had simply never been taught to recognize them as bids at all. He's learning now. I'm learning too, how to ask for things directly instead of simply absorbing the cost of asking for nothing. Tyler, for what it's worth, turned out to be less of a problem than I'd expected. He took his 20% seriously in a way nobody, including me, had predicted. Enrolled in a bookkeeping course at the community college that same spring, started actually showing up to the Tuesday reconciliation meetings I still run, and asked me, 3 months after the gala, with a kind of awkward sincerity that genuinely surprised me, whether I'd be willing to teach him how to read a cash flow statement properly. I said yes. I think some part of me wanted at least one person in that family to understand firsthand exactly how much invisible work it actually takes to keep a small construction company breathing through its thin months. I think about that night in October often. The patio, the champagne, the specific bright cruelty of being called a gold digger in front of 31 people who laughed because laughing was easier than asking questions. I don't think Eleanor meant it as the opening move in some calculated campaign. I think she said it because she genuinely believed it, in the careless way people believe things about family members whose actual contributions they've simply never bothered to look at closely. That's the thing I keep returning to. The thing I think matters most about this entire story. It was never really about malice. It was about the specific, ordinary failure of people who love each other to ever sit down and actually look at the numbers. Because looking at the numbers requires admitting that love alone doesn't automatically translate into fairness. And fairness, unlike love, has to be written down somewhere if you ever want it to survive a crisis. I still do the Tuesday reconciliations. I still keep the original promissory note in that same safe deposit box, though the active lien itself was released in full the day the final payment cleared, 11 months after that gala, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, with no champagne and no audience and no toast of any kind, which is, I've come to believe, exactly how the most important financial decisions in a family should be settled. Quietly, on paper, with nobody watching except the people who actually did the work. I am not the woman who married into money. I never was. I am the woman who spent 4 years keeping someone else's money from disappearing, asked for nothing in return, and discovered, the hard way, that the only thing more dangerous than being underestimated is letting yourself forget, even for a moment, to keep your own record of exactly what you're worth. That record is still in a safe deposit box, 3 blocks from my house, gathering exactly as much dust as I hope it ever needs to again.